here, as well as the project manager, Graham Pierce. And State of State Survey is run by our Office for Survey Research, and the director is with us as well, Lynn Stork. So thank you for being with us. A few differences about our survey in comparison to political polls that you might see regularly. We are in the field for a much longer time. This is over a 2-month period, so we're unable to show you a accurate snapshot of what's happening in any 1 or 2 day period. But we are able to call back people multiple times throughout the week and get a sample that we're comfortable with. And one thing to note is that I will show you our data on changes over time, but there is some evidence that changes over time in poll results in response to news events are actually less about people actually changing their mind and more about differential response to surveys from people who are supporters of each candidate and people moving in and out of the likely voter pool. So we actually have less evidence that people change their mind a lot of times during the campaign. That said, anything can happen, especially in the last week of the campaign. So we'll be showing you the results mostly today from the likely voter sample. Another difference in our survey in comparison to others is we have a relatively light likely voter screen. We just ask people how likely they are to participate and take those who say they are likely. We also will show you the results, but there aren't very many differences among those people who say they're absolutely certain to vote. So we don't have past voting history here. We're letting people tell us that they're going to participate. It sometimes results in big differences if you sort of assume what the electorate will look like, which can be beneficial, but we're doing no modeling of the electorate here. We're not telling you who turned out in previous elections. We're just telling you who said to us that they were likely to participate. All right, so over that full 2-month period, we did not show a close race. We have a 20-point lead for Hillary Clinton, 52% to 32% in the head-to-head race. We asked people to choose between those candidates first because we've seen that support for third-party candidates and undecideds tend to go down over the course of the campaign. So we asked them between those two first. And then we ask them again, if you don't give us Trump or Clinton as an answer, we say, well, if you absolutely had to decide who would you support among those candidates, and we still show 16% of the voters not giving us one of those two answers. So there's some resistance to making a decision among those two candidates. There is some sign that those 16% are more likely to come from your traditional Republican voters. So there might be some room for Trump to close the gap as traditional Republican voters decide to vote for Donald Trump. But you can see we already have Hillary Clinton above a majority. So even if that closes, we're unlikely to see a tied race. We also asked a 4-candidate race, adding Johnson and Stein, and there we see a significant percentage of voters saying they're supporting one of the two third-party candidates, 15% of the voters there. As I said, we do not show a lot of difference if we only incorporate those people who said they're absolutely certain to vote, a little bit less third-party support and undecideds. But we are not showing your traditional move where the people who are most likely to turn out to vote are a little bit more likely to be Republicans. Not in our data, in part because Donald Trump's supporters are disproportionately in the lower education levels. All right, so here's our trends over time. We have seen some tightening of the race at several times, but it's gone back up. The main time events that are associated with these changes look to be the presidential debates. We had a fairly typical pattern at the very beginning where you saw just increasing support for the candidates. But then it shifted a bit after the first presidential debate where Hillary Clinton, we show having a large lead. After the second debate, Donald Trump made some gains. And then after the third debate, Hillary Clinton gained again. We aren't seeing much evidence of closing, but I should point out that we can't just take our survey as definitive. Other pollsters are seeing some changes at the end and are showing a much closer race than us. So certainly if I had to bet, I would say 20 points would be more likely to be on the high side than on the low side. Barack Obama won Michigan by 9 points and I think 17 points in the last 2 elections. So it's not out of the question that we could have a large win for Hillary Clinton. But other polls are not necessarily showing it as quite a wide race as we are. And as you can see, there is certainly room for Donald Trump to grow in the last week. But we also have observed a bit of a ceiling, at least in our weekly results, where Donald Trump really hasn't gotten above that 40% barrier, whereas Hillary Clinton does seem to be able to at certain moments in the campaign. This is the 4-way race, some somewhat similar dynamics, though you see a little bit more of people going to Gary Johnson late in the campaign, and a little bit less of a definitive Clinton lead after the first debate, and maybe more late. Now, I should point out that this is these are weekly surveys where, we're surveying 100 people or so, so there are very large error bars around that. So even the changes that we are observing could easily not be real changes in levels of support. That said, it is unique about this election that those third-party candidates and the undecideds are maintaining their indecision about the 2 major candidates late in the campaign. We usually would see those go down, and other pollsters, at least nationally, are seeing some declines for Gary Johnson late in the campaign. We also asked each of the candidates' supporters if they were supporting mainly their candidate or against the other candidate. Hillary Clinton supporters were roughly evenly divided, a couple more saying that they're voting for Clinton rather than against Trump. Trump supporters were much more likely to say they're voting against Hillary Clinton in comparison to for Donald Trump. So even though Trump is the less popular candidate, opposition to Hillary Clinton may be motivating, maybe more motivating for Trump supporters than the opposite. Now, Michigan has more Democrats than Republicans. So for Republicans to win, they have to win the independents by a large share, and they're not doing that. In addition to that, there's more leakage on the Republican side than there is on the Democratic side, and more lack of commitment, especially among the Republican-leaning independents, than there is on the Democratic side. Now, I should say we also do have slightly more Democrats and independents, actually a lot more independents than usual, and fewer Republicans than usual. We don't know if that is just a sampling artifact or if that presents a real change in party identification associated with the current election. But if so, it's sort of in the direction away from Republicans and toward the more independent categories. Now, I said there's more Democrats than Republicans, but there's also more conservatives than liberals. So whereas Democrats have to win, Republicans have to win the majority of the independents, Democrats have to win the majority of the moderates in order to win the campaign. And Hillary Clinton is doing that by a very large margin. Even those people who lean conservative or somewhat conservative are not overwhelmingly on Donald Trump's side in this campaign. So she's winning more conservative votes than most Democratic candidates would. Part of the reason is the overwhelming support among non-white voters. Many of those people do not consider themselves liberal, and there's some conservatives as well. But regardless of your party identification and ideology, non-white voters in our survey are going overwhelmingly for Hillary Clinton, and very few are going for Donald Trump. But we also saw Clinton winning among the white non-Hispanic population as well. So this is not all due to minority voters, but certainly her large lead in the aggregate is a result of disproportionate support from minorities. Same story on gender. We show the race basically tied among men, but an overwhelming margin for Hillary Clinton among women. So this mirrors other polling and explains some of that leakage from the Republican and conservative side among traditional Republican voters, just really not sold on Donald Trump in this campaign. We see less pronounced trends among education, but you can see them more if you just look at the white non-Hispanic population. So we show Hillary Clinton leading at all education levels. You can see overwhelmingly among anybody who's spent any time in graduate programs. But Donald Trump is winning among white, lower educated voters. But we have Hillary Clinton winning at all other levels of education, even among whites. So we do show some pronounced education effects, but mainly among whites. So Hillary Clinton has the potential turnout problem that African Americans might not be quite as excited about participating when there's no African American candidate on the ballot. But Donald Trump also has a turnout problem, which is that lower educated white voters don't traditionally turn out as well in presidential elections. And so we'll see if they do in this one, because that's where he's drawing the bulk of his support. Age, we show Hillary Clinton winning at all age levels. A typical pattern that you see is that the youngest age bracket is disproportionately for independents or third-party candidates or hasn't made a decision. You can see Donald Trump looks a little bit better among older voters, but again, Hillary Clinton's winning across the board here. We also show relatively strong geographic spread across Michigan for Hillary Clinton. Among our regions, Donald Trump is winning in only the regions surrounding the Thumb and the Bay Cities. Whereas Hillary Clinton is winning everywhere else. Now, these are, again, small samples with large error bars around them, especially when we're surveying about 70 people or so in the UP, for example. So we don't have a good estimate there. But you also see that Hillary Clinton, again, gets her overwhelming support when you get to Detroit, and that makes up for her larger margin statewide. But surprising in comparison to previous elections is that we have Hillary Clinton doing fine in West Michigan. We have a lot of reluctance to support Donald Trump in both Southwest and West Central Michigan, and even in the northern part of Michigan. Other pollsters have showed Donald Trump doing somewhat better in the northern parts, so it's possible that he would do so. But this is a relatively wide geographic spread for a Democratic candidate in Michigan. Income, we do not show major effects, except that we can dispel the notion that Donald Trump is mobilizing the poor. That does not seem to be the case. If anything, the poorest voters are more likely to be supporting Hillary Clinton than people of other income levels. That is, Donald Trump is winning among this population of white, lower educated voters, but there's not really an income effect. It's really an education and race effect. All right, we're also interested in whether the candidates, people who supported other primary candidates, have come home to their political party. Now, we asked people not only who they voted for, but who they supported. So memories are sometimes foggy here, but of those people who said that they supported Bernie Sanders in the primary, most of them have come home to Hillary Clinton, but there are some supporting Trump. Among those people who supported John Kasich or Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz, we're showing only 60% were willing in the course of our survey to voice support for Donald Trump. Now, paradoxically, that actually means there's some room to grow for Donald Trump in our survey from his low position, because if you voted for another Republican candidate or supported one, you're more likely to support one in the general election. But this mirrors something we're seeing anecdotally, that Republicans are not necessarily willing to get on board with Donald Trump. Now, we're also interested in what kinds of attitudes predict support for Donald Trump. And I'm introducing a new set of questions that I created to try to predict support for Trump and Clinton. So we asked people to agree or disagree with the statement, "Our country is changing too fast, undermining traditional American values." It's sort of a speed of social change, but it also has in mind, at least in the background, our growing diversity. And you can see that 41% of the state strongly agrees with that statement. So that's a fairly widespread attitude that our country is changing too fast. And that's where Donald Trump is drawing his support. At every other level, you see Hillary Clinton having higher levels of support, especially among people who disagree with that statement, who do not fear social change. Now, there's agreement bias in surveys, so a lot of people agree with whatever you tell them. So we ask it the other way as well. We say, by accepting diverse cultures and lifestyles, our country is steadily improving. It's sort of an acceptance of social change. And there we see that those people who strongly agree with that statement are overwhelmingly supporting Hillary Clinton. Those people who disagree with that statement at any level are supporting Donald Trump. So we think we've uncovered a set of attitudes that are predictive of Trump's support here. This happens independent of partisanship and ideology and some of the other factors that I'm going to show you in a moment. So these attitudes toward social change do seem to be mattering in our election. But so do racial attitudes. We ask a couple of questions from traditional scale of racial resentment. The question asks you to agree or disagree that it lists several minority groups who overcame prejudice and says African Americans should do the same without any favors. That question, among those people who strongly agree with that statement, Trump is winning handily. Among people who disagree with that statement at any level, Hillary Clinton is winning a relatively strong support. Again, we ask it the other way as well. It's sort of a indicator of perceived racial disadvantage. So we say, because of generations of slavery and discrimination, that makes it hard for African Americans to rise economically. So if you agree with that, if you perceive high levels of remaining discrimination against African Americans, then you're overwhelmingly likely to support Hillary Clinton. If you disagree with that statement, especially strongly, then you're more likely to support Donald Trump. We also ask more direct race questions, though, and we do also find effects there. So we ask people, literally, basically on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate Latinos? How would you rate African Americans? How would you rate whites? A general feeling thermometer toward these social groups. And what we find is that those people, there's only a small portion of the public, 16%, that will give us a higher number for whites than African Americans, and similar numbers that will give us a higher number for whites than Latinos. Much larger that will give us a higher number for whites than Muslims, though they're not directly comparable there. But what you find is among those voters who have those racial attitudes, they're overwhelmingly supporting Donald Trump. This is just among whites or non-Hispanic whites. And so you can see that Hillary Clinton is only winning among white non-Hispanics who do not rate whites higher than any of these three groups. So among those who we say are not ethnocentric, they don't have a higher level for whites than for any of those three alternative groups. They're supporting Hillary Clinton. And of course, all the minority voters that are excluded from here, most of them are supporting Hillary Clinton as well. Now, I should point out that we have been able to show that this is not just repeating the same attitudes. There are some people who have these negative racial attitudes about other groups, but this racial resentment scales still do independently predict Trump support. So some of Trump's support is about direct attitudes toward racial groups. Other is about broader racial liberalism and conservatism, and others is about attitudes toward social change. We also asked about vote for Congress. Among all voters, we have it at 45% to 32%. So still a substantial lead for Democrats in congressional races statewide in our survey. And perhaps troubling for Republican congressional candidates is that not all of Trump's supporters are, even though there's a smaller proportion, not all of them are going along with supporting Republican candidates for Congress. So perhaps some potential trouble in the congressional races. We also wanted to know how much people are paying attention to the campaign, how much they're learning, and even despite the overwhelming media coverage for this campaign, there's still a lot of people who don't know much about it. So one indicator of that is the people who know who the vice presidential nominees are. We just ask you, can you tell me who Hillary Clinton's vice presidential nominee is? And only a third of all respondents and a little more than that among likely voters can name Tim Kaine. He's just been a relatively invisible vice presidential nominee in comparison to the top of the ticket. Now, Mike Pence is our neighboring governor, and he has a much higher name identification than Tim Kaine, though you're still talking about, less than 2/3 of the voters can name Mike Pence as Donald Trump's vice presidential nominee. So even though we've all heard about the election for months and we can't possibly learn any more about it, there are still quite a few voters out there who aren't paying enough attention to know even who the vice presidential nominees are. Now, we're also releasing today some data from another survey that we conduct called the Michigan Policy Insiders Panel. These respondents are 400 political insiders who work in and around state government, including legislative staff, administrative staff, and people in the lobbying and advocacy community. And this is just a comparison between the Michigan public and the policy insiders. So even though the insiders are relatively split on the congressional races, it's 49 to 43 for Democrats across that insider population, they are not overwhelmingly split on the presidential race. Hillary Clinton is winning among insiders 63% to 18%. So even though Donald Trump doesn't have strong support in the Michigan public, he has way less support within the policymaking community in Lansing, illustrating a bit of a disconnect between Republican elites and their voters. And one side of that is who these people say they voted for in the presidential primary. The biggest winner was John Kasich. And among those insiders who said they were supporting John Kasich, actually we had more people say they're supporting Hillary Clinton now than supporting Donald Trump. So some resistance among Republican elites that we've seen in endorsements and public statements that's also reflected in our Policy Insiders survey. We asked both the public and the policy insiders to predict the results of the election, and overwhelmingly people thought Hillary Clinton would win both in Michigan and nationally. There is some evidence that who you think is going to win sometimes is a better predictor than who yourself are going to vote for. So people overwhelmingly think Hillary Clinton will win, but among insiders, it's not even close. Only 8% of insiders think Trump will win nationwide. So even among Republican elites, not much faith in Donald Trump. We also asked them to make a direct prediction as to how well Hillary Clinton would do nationally. And sorry, we reversed it, how well the Republicans would do in the state legislative races. And the average prediction among those insiders had Hillary Clinton winning fairly handily, 330 electoral votes out of the 270, well above the 270 that she needs to win. They did not have as much confidence in the Democrats in the House. They forecast on average the Republicans to lose 5 House seats and to retain their majority in the state House. So at least from the insiders' perspective, they're expecting some coattails, some move down to the local races, but not quite as strong as they expect Hillary Clinton to win nationwide and in Michigan. All right, open for questions.
Yeah, but did you, on the congressional, did you break it out by districts at all, or wasn't the sample worthwhile to do that?
The sample's not real worthwhile to do by congressional districts. There wasn't a huge, I did just do the region crosstab, there wasn't a huge difference with the presidential race. So we show some reluctance to support both Trump and the congressional candidates.
Well, the one that intrigued me was the UP and Northern Lower, the first district.
Yeah, we don't have enough data from that district to make a good estimate.
On the Trump country changing too fast, he was at 52. What was Hillary Clinton's number on that slide, please?
32.
32.
Yeah. And then it's especially strong when you get to the people who disagree with that statement, where you see overwhelming Hillary Clinton support. And then on the other side, the bigger agreement on the bigger difference on the agreement side is when you say it the other way. By accepting diversity, our country is improving. That you get that 74 to 11 split between the
In Michigan, there's been a lot of focus on Macomb and Oakland counties. Did you break it down by county at all, or was it just the districts that you focused on in the areas of Michigan?
Again, we don't have large enough samples in particular counties to give you a good estimate, but the Southeast Michigan advantage for Hillary Clinton was relatively widespread. Certainly people on the ground are saying that, Macomb should be at least relatively better for Trump, and Oakland should be relatively worse compared to previous Republican nominees. I don't have any reason to dispute that, and it's somewhat confirmed in the education numbers and the elite numbers that you see.
Matt, could you go back to the map and show us, when you say Southeast Michigan, that means Wayne, Oakland, Macomb,
Wayne outside of Detroit.
Wayne out, yeah.
So I didn't color code Detroit there, but it includes Wayne outside of Detroit.
Includes Genesee, Monroe, Lenawee, Washtenaw, and Livingston.
Yeah, that relatively broad red area there.
Yeah.
So.
And St. Clair, I think.
Other questions?
I'd like to make a comment,
All right.
which I thought might be of interest to some of the folks here. The survey was founded in 1994. The founding director of the State of the State Survey was Brian Silver, who has recently retired as a professor of political science here at Michigan State. He is, I think, better known as the father of Nate Silver, who, if you follow this kind of world, Nate Silver is the guy with the 538 blog, well known for having correctly called every state in both 2008 and 2012. Just a good factoid to know. Name the two most famous graduates of East Lansing High School: Nate Silver and Larry Page of Google. All right.
Can you go back to that slide that Tim had you pull up?
Yes.
Explain to me, how do you know what the respondent is reacting to? Which side of that question? That the country is changing too fast? Oh no, there was the other one. That in particular, are they reacting to the concept of diversity, or are they reacting to the notion that the country itself is improving?
It could be that
That wasn't a rhetorical question.
Yeah, it could be that there's a generic attitude against improvement, but we tried to stimulate thoughts about diversity as much as possible in this. It is strongly associated with these racial resentment questions. Both of these questions are strongly associated with the racial resentment questions. So there is at least some indication that the same people who are giving us the opposition to social change here are also giving us more conservative racial attitudes in a comparison, but there's still some independent effects. So the reason I actually put these on here is because other people have shown nationwide that there's a big effect for these racial attitudes. But these questions to me seemed quite specific to African Americans. And so what I wondered is if there was a broader attitude toward diversity, since the campaign hasn't focused as much on African Americans as on Latinos and immigration. I thought maybe there was a broader opposition to growing diversity. And so that's what we tried to tap. But yes, it's possible that it's a little bit too much double-barreled and people could just say, no, our country's not improving.
Charlie, you remember what your horse race numbers were 4 years ago?
We had Obama ahead substantially. I couldn't come up with, I don't right offhand.
Was it more or less in line with his final margin, or a lot more?
We think that
We had a whole lot of undecided.
we had a lot of undecideds because we asked it. We didn't have a survey that was this close before the election in 2012. So we had, as I recall, we had more than a third undecided, like 40, almost 40% undecided. So hard to compare with what we had 4 years ago.
But yeah, I mean, we do not, I mean, I personally don't expect, for example, for Gary Johnson to be winning, north of 10% in Michigan. So, those people are going to go somewhere, and the people who aren't picking between those candidates are going to go somewhere. And among the voters that are left, they're more likely to be your traditional Republican voters. So if we do see closing, it's likely going to be from people moving out of those other categories in comparison. That's something that sort of you would sort of expect to occur. But Hillary Clinton's maintained relatively high support throughout.
Well, your survey is spanning a period of about 60 days, as I understand.
Yeah, that's correct.
Is it possible that the actual lead in the story is not so much that that Clinton is winning by a huge margin, as it is that there, if you can agree with Mitchell and some of the other people that are doing the regular polling, that this election is closing a lot faster than anyone could have anticipated?
I have continued to expect that to happen, but we just haven't seen it over the period that we are doing it. We've just seen
Yeah, but you're
bumps.
seeing it over a period of 60 days.
Yeah, it's true. So we could be off by a large margin at the end of that time scale. But the other thing I just point out is that when people are doing these 2 or 3 day surveys, they're getting differential response based on who wants to participate in the survey at that moment. And they're getting changes that are based on whether people are included or not in the likely voter pool based on how they respond to those kinds of questions. So that could be indicative of who's going to turn out. That's the best case for it, is people who want to participate in the surveys are more likely to turn out. But nationwide, there's a lot of evidence that when you do panel surveys, for example, you interview the same people before and after, there's very little change in actual opinion. So these changes over time that you're observing in the polling results are mostly about who's responding to the survey and who's included in the likely voter pool.
So her drop in support from October 26th down to the 30th is insignificant?
No, it's not insignificant. What we often see in the head-to-head numbers, you can see it begin a little bit earlier, but I would say that it indicates that the bump from the first debate was not sustained, which is pretty typical pattern if you were to interpret our data.
But don't you want to be closing the election going up rather than going down?
Yeah, so we do show this period where it looked like the election was closing, but at least for us, that period isn't now. That period was earlier. So I certainly expect if you poll this week, you may see. We saw, some tiny bit of change. So it's possible that you'll continue to see that. And certainly I expect, I said we have 16% who are unwilling to support either candidate, and that they're more likely to be traditional Republican voters. So you think Donald Trump has more room to grow. But the part I would be skeptical about is that Hillary Clinton is actually losing support rather than different people are responding to the surveys at different times of the cycle.
So it's a decline with an asterisk. It's not really a decline.
Well, it should certainly be reported with an asterisk in general because we're only dealing with 100 respondents for each point up here. So yes, it's certainly a decline with an asterisk, but I think the broad patterns are somewhat consistent with what you're seeing elsewhere.
Do you buy the notion that some Trump supporters might be unwilling to admit it publicly, have been quoted by some?
There's not a lot of evidence of that. We have, not us, but in general, social scientists have a way of assessing that, where they ask you, could you agree with how many of the following 2 statements do you agree with? Donald Trump is great, and then we ask you the same thing with 3 statements, and we try to measure the difference between how many that you do, the people who got the Donald Trump statement added in comparison to the others. And that's a way of sort of sussing out people that may not be willing to tell you that they're supporting Donald Trump, but are willing to say they agree with 2 out of 3 statements. And there's no evidence from those studies of people who are shy Trump supporters. There's actually slightly more shy Hillary supporters in those studies. So not much evidence of that.
Other than the lower educated white voters, is there another subgroup in the electorate that is clearly for Trump?
Not demographically, other than strong Republicans. Strong Republicans are for Donald Trump by a very large margin. But in the attitude levels, I think there is. So, people who have negative, for the starting point, people who have negative racial attitudes about Latinos and African Americans are overwhelmingly for Trump, and people who disagree with that increasing diversity is a good trend in our country are also overwhelmingly for Trump.
So let me ask one other question, just to make sure I'm clear on this point. This is one sample over
Absolutely,
over
one
a
sample.
60-day period. So any variation that we might see might be based on 20 or 30 participants.
Well, it's 7 days is what these are telling you, so it's more like 100. But yes, those changes from day to day are based on 20 or 30 people,
Which
or
would
even
not be
less, dropping
considered,
in and out of the
which
sample.
would not be considered in and of themselves significant.
Right, absolutely. So this is a way to look at how much change there was overall during the period that we were surveying, but not a good way of assessing, there was this change in this period. The only thing I'm just adding to that is it turns out there is actually not a good way to do that unless you have a panel survey where you have the same respondents to actually see if they're changing their attitudes. Because if you interview a new set of people, you are not necessarily going to get the same people. But yes, having people who have 1,000 respondents in 3 days are more likely to be able to see a change in comparison to the next 3 days.
Which is more likely to be able to rely on the change that they see representing the overall population.
Well, that I'm not as confident in, but yes, in general, yes. But the issue is whether you're getting the same people.
I have a question, if you don't mind. Did you look at all at the differences between the cell phone sample and the landline sample?
We did not see a big difference between cell and landline in comparison to, like in the primary survey where we saw Bernie Sanders supporters were overwhelmingly on cell phones. So we didn't see as much.
Can I ask you a question about sort of a coattail effect? We always talk about how much does this person hurt or not the rest of the ticket, if you will.
Yes.
I don't think this is in your data, but if you could guess on it. We have a lot of gerrymandering going on in all states, but Michigan, we're very Republican in House and Senate and have been for a couple of decades or so, perhaps. At what point do we take a very solid blue or red district going the other way, depending on the top or not the top necessarily, but at the top of the ticket? The big things that everybody comes out voting for. At what point do we see those shifting? Or do we have to wait for next census to actually shift the districts?
Well, so first we have the margin, closer, but still Democrats, majority state, or not majority, a plurality statewide in those congressional races. We're also seeing that although there's a big match between who you're voting for in president and Congress, there's actually more drop off among Trump supporters. So that's potentially a problem for Republicans. But geographically, as you saw, there's statewide reluctance to support Trump, but the Hillary Clinton support is overwhelmingly coming from Detroit. So that means that if you have even without gerrymandered districts, but you just have a lot more districts outside of the city, that's going to affect the translation of the statewide vote to the congressional races. Nationally, there's people who've estimated that you would need like a 12% Hillary Clinton win to make it a 50-50 chance that the Republicans would take the U.S. House and the Democrats would take the U.S. House, for example. So that's the kind of scale that you would need to get that change.
When you were doing your screen, did you try to find out when people told you they probably weren't going to vote? Did you explore that at all, or just say goodbye?
What? No. We interview everyone, so we still ask them who they're likely to support. But the surprise here is that we just didn't see much difference going up the scale of likelihood to vote and who people were supporting. Normally, you should see at least a little bit more Republican at the high end of the scale. So it could be that the sort of most likely Republican voters are in part the ones that are not quite committed to Trump.
Can I ask you a question about your elite sample?
Yes.
It's that separate thing. Was there an indication on there? Is it previous congressional voting that would give you the biggest indication of the partisan split within that elite group?
Oh, no, we have party direct. There's slightly more Republicans than Democrats, but a lot. But it's pretty even in our elite group. So even though we have slightly more Republicans and Democrats, or let's say roughly even, we have this massive split from Trump to Clinton. So among elites in Michigan, they're not sold on Trump, and in part because those Republicans in the sample are the ones who said they were for John Kasich in the primary.
Was the media included in the quote insiders?
They are, though they're a pretty small part.
Must be very small if they don't have you in there, Jim.
How do you know I wasn't?
Last thoughts? All right, well, I can stick around and answer any questions, and Charlie's also happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Thank you.
We'll send out a link to the PowerPoint, and I think it's already posted on the MSU site.
We interview outside of that.
Sure.
Right.
Okay, great. If you go faster than this.